Guys, so that is a great segue into the good neighbor policy within this realm of trust and safety and community. Just here to remind you guys that on behalf of Swimply, again, we are totally about ensuring that the relationships that we have with our neighbors on a local level always excel and continue to succeed even through the Swimply experience. So what Swimply has done is we've created this good neighbor policy. And really it's just a couple of steps to remind Swimply hosts and encourage them to again, maintain that good neighbor relationship. So the couple of items we remind everyone of, firstly, if you haven't already, please ensure that you're notifying your neighbors of your Swimply experience. If you're like me, you've likely maybe initially tried to, you thought you'd keep it under wraps and folks wouldn't learn about it. But for me, I probably didn't make it past 3 or 4 visitors before my neighbors asked me if I was renting out my pool. So as mentioned in number 1, just get ahead of it and be transparent. Secondly, in that conversation, please share contact information with your hosts. I'm sorry, with your neighbors. By doing so, in the event that anything takes place during a visit that a neighbor may have concerns about, as opposed to them maybe escalating, calling the cops out of any concern, they can go to you first as the first line of defense. A quick example is, I know I've had swimmers accidentally block off a piece of a neighbor's driveway. So again, instead of them calling the cops, they were able to contact me and we quickly had that resolved. Number 3, make sure your neighbors know that you're being responsible. So I know for myself, I implement a number of rules that are outlined on my listing. That includes things like no music or keeping music to a certain level. We don't have a lot of parking space outside, so I ask folks to carpool and not to bring any more than 4 cars. And I also limit the number of guests I have to what is comfortable for my pool. And I know Alyssa also spoke of that from a safety perspective as well. So make sure if you have any rules, which I suggest everyone should have some, you're sharing those with your neighbors so that they can feel some sense of safety, that all things are being considered. Now, the final step, number 4, we're home. So as hosts, we're not required to be home, but quite honestly, I do try to be home for 100% of my visits, especially if it's folks' first time coming to use my pool. And in doing so, definitely share that information again with your neighbors. If they know that you as a responsible homeowner are there making sure everything is under control, then again, that is reassuring. Alrighty, guys, so that wraps up the good neighbor policy, which takes us to our last but certainly not least presenter. That again is Cameron, and she's here on behalf of Swimply's regulatory and legal team. So with that, Cameron.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to try to walk through this as fast as possible. I know the legal regulatory stuff sometimes is little hard to understand immediately, but that's why we have these slides and here for Q&A. Essentially, these are the first kind of 4 areas we see that a lot of, if any of you have ever received a ticket or hear of other people, these are the areas that are being risen. But the top topics, we are not a public pool, despite if the State Department of Health calls you one. We are just like a short-term rental, which is basically Airbnb. Your home amenity rental, which is pool rentals, does not yet explicitly exist in any local code, but that does not make us illegal. It is a new concept because we don't meet the exact definition of a short-term rental, but that does not mean you're illegal. And lastly, you are not a home occupation. Next slide. All right, so you're not a public pool. So one reason to remind people where we've had incidences where they say, well, I can become one. You can't become a public pool because there's from the get-go, there are different construction codes. So when your pool was put in as a residential pool, it met different code sections than when they're putting in a commercial pool. So off the bat, they're basically calling it something you can't ever be. Plus there's all sorts of daily maintenance regulations, which no homeowners can want to be. Secondly, public pool regulations were not intended for residential pools, and sharing of your pool does not change this. So you'll see a lot of times there's a definition and they'll note that, you know, it's only open to the homeowner and their guests. And if you're renting it out, it's open to the public. That is not the intent of that definition. You have control over who you bring to your house. These are still your guests. Even if they reference sharing your pool for a fee, that definition occurred before modern day short-term rentals, and they've had plenty of time to update those definitions. So the intent of that regulation is not meant for your residential pool. It does not change just because you have a new technology or new concept of home sharing. As mentioned, these state legislatures and local government draft these public pool definitions. Their intent cannot be misconstrued to shut your pool down. So they can't use an old definition and try to apply it to something new here. The agency, if it's interpreting the code differently than the legislature intended, they're creating law. That is outside of their purview. So they must defer the legislature. And that is something we push back on your all's behalf and fight with these Department of Health. And we make that clear to them. As noted, these definitions were created almost universally before 2008, which was when Airbnb was founded. So the modern day concept of home rental was 2008. They've had 15 years to update their definitions and clarify that your pool was viewed as public, or any home sharing of your house and your pool was public, and they've not done so. So essentially, we know that that was not the intent, and we've had a few of these incidences, and we've pushed back successfully. But further, state and local agencies can't treat you differently. So they can't say because you use your pool, rent a pool on Swimply, you are a commercial pool. So, they'd have to prove that they're calling every Airbnb and every vacation home that exists in your state prior to Swimply or prior to Airbnb as a public pool, which they have not done. So this is how we protect you on that end. And you're definitely not a public pool. Next slide. Going on that, equality is key. So essentially, again, this is no different than if your neighbor is renting their home on Airbnb or VRBO. We are all part of the home sharing economy. It's just different subsets of it. So if your local government is allowing short-term rentals, so Airbnb via regulations, or they leave them unregulated but allow them, they cannot be coming after you and say, well, you are illegal. And they are not, because they have to be treated equally. They're both part of that home sharing economy. So again, they must apply their regulations equally, and you have that right. Now, if a local government regulates short-term rentals, they should allow your rentals, and they should be doing that and saying, hey, we are already allowing the home sharing economy. A lot of them will try not to, but our argument back is you're already allowing this. The local government regulates short-term rentals, but have some kind of don't include you or in this, they, saying you are illegal, we tell them to look back at their code. What did they do and before they regulated short-term rentals? Did they allow Airbnb to function? Well, then they should allow your rental on Swimply. And again, if they do not regulate short-term rentals and they allow them to operate, there's no reason you can't operate. So we always tell people to go look at what is your community doing as it relates to short-term rentals or Airbnb. Next slide. So this is the biggest thing that a lot of you guys have raised to us. Well, they tell me I don't exist in code, so I'm illegal. That is not factual. So we don't exist in any code anywhere. We are a new concept. And so we're not explicitly defined. If though we're part of the home sharing economy, the definition of amenity rental is not explicitly defined in code. So while we can often fit broadly under short-term rental regulations, there's often definition and enforcement issues, such as they might have a nightly limit that you can rent out versus something like hour limitations, because you rent by the hour, not the night, or they'll put caps based on bedrooms, the amount of people who can be in your home based on how many bedrooms you have. That obviously does not make sense for your pool. This gets very confusing to local governments. So even if they're addressing and admit that they regulate short-term rentals, they don't really understand how to make you fit within that world. So they use this catch-all. You don't exist in my code. We don't explicitly allow it in our zoning code, and thus you are illegal. It's an extremely weak argument and something that often does not get held up. And that is because they're saying anything not explicitly allowed is banned. So think about that from a zoning perspective. You couldn't even put a kiddie pool in your front yard for your dog or kids to play in because they have not explicitly allowed it. If we got even beyond zoning, that you could say any law that's not explicitly allowed under the same argument would be banned. So you wouldn't be able to walk down the street and drink a Diet Pepsi if they had not explicitly allowed it. So it's a very weak argument, but something the governments often defer back to because that is all they really know, and they don't really know where you fit. So it's really not an appropriate regulation, and they do need to go back and update their code if they want to ban you or find a place to squeeze you under something like short-term rentals. And that is something we're consistently working with local governments to educate them on. Next slide. All right, so you're not a home occupation. We often see too, if they say, okay, well, you exist in our code, but you got to be a home occupation. Well, here's the problem. Home occupations are not intended for home rentals. They're for like home offices, small businesses like hairdressers or related occupations. And they're usually drafted in a manner that restrict any outdoor activities, the amount of people who can be on your property at one time. And so essentially what they're saying when they try to say that, it's like, you're a home occupation, but you actually can't be a home occupation. So they will deny you a home occupation license. But again, to reiterate, you're not a home occupation because you're part of the home sharing economy. It is not an occupation. And thus, this is another reason they must look at you along the lines of how they're looking at short-term rentals. There's one caveat. There are some new pieces of legislation. If you happen to be in Iowa or Florida, there are new statewide legislation that discuss home occupation laws that are extremely broad and welcoming. And you actually might fall underneath those, which actually is not a bad thing, because the way they're defining it, you would actually be allowed to continue to rent your pool. But those are just two states that have passed this new model legislation that is very broad on home occupation. Next slide, thank you. All right, so we are, I know this is fast and a little confusing because I go very fast on this stuff, but we are actually using these arguments and fighting for you at the local level to try to stop any restriction on your property rights. And we know at times it feels like you're being left out there. There's a ton of tiny little towns throughout the US, but we were always here to help analyze the situation. And every step we're doing, if we're working another market to make a change, is helping that flow into your market, because the more markets we turn over, the more governments we stop directly from restricting you, the more it's going to flow around as people are going to understand what you are and that this is normalized and how to address you. So as I said, please always feel free to reach out to us at regulatory@swimply.com. We'll take a look at the ticket or the issue you've received and help analyze the situation. Sending us the issue, be it a piece of legislation you've seen or a ticket you've received or a notice you've received, is extremely helpful because we can actually read what they're saying you are, because oftentimes someone will leave you a voicemail or come by and say you're illegal, but they haven't said is it because they're trying to call you a home occupation, or they trying to say you don't exist in code, because then we can evaluate and analyze and send you back a response to how you can push back directly. So again, where I say to have you guys help push back, governments love to hear from their citizens. They don't always love to hear from companies, but the more they hear from their citizens that they're not going to stand for this, that they know their rights, the more likely they are to address us and actually work with us. And finally, the worst part about this is government moves extremely slowly. We're working as fast as we can, and we push them as hard as we can, but they often move at a snail's pace. So remember, like when we are talking to governments, when we are pushing back, it doesn't happen overnight, but we are making large headways in the last year, and we'll continue to make those, and we'll continue to fight for everyone, and we'll continue to make sure that you guys end up in code and be 100% clearly legal. But today you guys are all legal anyways, but we're going to make sure every government understands that.